We have a whole slew of terms for what is happening at the moment in the interstices between art and technology, if the two can any longer be adequately distinguished. Bioart, biomedia, flesh art, living art, live installation, art life, technoscience art, genetic art, transgenic art, medical art, genetic iconography, and so forth, and all of them to one degree or another depend on and play with a complex of biotechnical procedures whose raw material is bare life, the cruel innocence of life beneath good and evil, as Badiou puts it in Ethics. As the intensive pronoun implies, this new form of art that does things with life itself does not involve a medium in the old sense of the word, but is rather preoccupied with a kind of literalism, a very thin membrane between sequences and their expression, or what optimally might be called operationalism or extreme realism, that is to say, representations that do what it is they represent. I take the term operationalism from Norbert Wiener, the founder of cybernetics, a system he describes as one of, quote, communication and control. Wiener opposed operationalism to pictorialism, as we know, and elaborated the fantasy underlying the former in a strange, and dare we say, slightly wacky 1964 book entitled God and Golem Inc. Operationalism, or operative literalism, is a particular type of determinism that dreams of an actionable, if often invisible and nonsensible, isomorphism, if that's the word, between codes and matter and the collapse of image and functionality. By fantasy, I mean not an unrealizable imaginary or supplement, but rather the types of imaginary rehearsals of the future that under the right conditions, and if a large enough number of people share them, become actuated and actionable. What I want to try to do this afternoon is simply to throw into question a ruling assumption about the biotechnic, which is that this type of project or activity is eo ipso political in nature. More particularly, I'm interested in trying to understand how art and aesthetics in general function within biotechnic determinism, which possesses the force of literalism and is largely resistant to contestation, I will argue. I will limit my remarks to transgenic art. Here are some thinkers who I think might help us go about tackling the question of bioart, and whose work I'd like to bring into the ambit of the inquiry. Flusser on design, on humanizations, forms, and stuffing. Arendt on the anti-political and totalitarianism, indeed Oliver Arendt. Agamben on liturgy, the apparatus and bare life. Foucault on biopower and the apparatus, Riegel on the mobile and the immobile. Summers on aniconicisim and contemporary forms of iconoclasm, and indeed any thinker who has tackled the subject of iconoclasm. Benjamin on distraction, Manovich on imageless images, Tavelite on cynical capitalism, Kubler on sequences. Last, any text that attempt to analyze or conjecture in an interesting way what the world was like at the advent of writing, even though it must be said that the two situations are not really analogous given the accretionary structure of so-called natural language. And here are some major questions as I see them. What is the anti-political, and what is its relation to determinism? What is its relation to desymbolization? In what ways does biotechnic determinism differ from other forms of determinism? To what extent does the political require mediation, and if so, what kind? What is art, and how does it differ from aesthetics? And why is this difference significant, particularly now? How should we reconsider the question of the image? And how can we reconfigure the old definitions to meet the demands of the moment? Does every point of visuality represent a point of no return? What kind of determinism does visuality represent, and how can it work to reconfigure or redirect biotechnic initiatives? If we live increasingly in an age of imageless images, how is this point of no return marked? Or is the function of an image, as Flusser argued, no longer that of warning, but rather of concealment? Are all forms of literalism, biotechnic or other, anti-political? What does literalism accomplish? When is it called for? When should it be questioned? So forth. What is recognition? How closely is it related to the visual? And how important is it that we continue to recognize ourselves in the world as beings that to some degree escape the determined? Last, what is the role of aesthetics in relation to the biotechnic? How is it functioning, and toward what ends? It is in the realm of transgenic art above all, I think, that we witness art's renewed interest in power relations, and the question is whether this interest signals simple survival, a plea for the continued relevance of art, a reaction to the general relegation of the fine arts to the merely pictorial, or something rather broader in scope and significance for the world at large, a project that would indeed be political in nature. There seems to be an unprecedentedly radical split between an apolitical or anti-political inside and a political outside, to quote Latour, with the move to visualize and politicize biotechnic procedures being decidedly secondary ex post facto. The amount of slippage between this inside and outside is exceedingly small, the degree of technological determinism very high, and I will be using the term literalism throughout this brief presentation to indicate minimal slippage. Again, I am interested in the relation of the apolitical, the anti-political, and the political, how this relation differs now from what it once was, and how the process works by which apolitical and anti-political forces and phenomena are made to enter into the political realm. That is to say, how they are brought into or even forced into the political realm through negotiation, contestation, and challenge. And last, how the image and visualization in general function or might function in this process. Hannah Arendt is one of the few thinkers to have addressed directly the question of the anti-political. The political is possible only by and through a certain partialness, a certain ungraspability, unpredictability, and happy unknowability. In contrast, the anti-political principle is essentially totalizing and often totalitarian by nature. As a sovereign force in the world that involves persons in their totality, love, for instance, is essentially anti-political. Love, by its very nature, she writes in The Human Condition, is unworldly, and it is for this reason that it is not only apolitical but anti-political, perhaps the most powerful of all anti-political human forces. End of quote. It is not only love, of course, that belongs in the category of the anti-political, but also violence, sexuality, pain, and in general anything that resists and is inconducive to collective decision-making, public action, negotiations of the usual sort, anything that disallows, again, challenge, contestation, and collective co-efficacy. Anything that necessitates withdrawal from the world, anything that conflates presentation and representation, transforming every symbol into a sign, and I think we can say vice versa, every sign into a symbol. As an aside, the function of symbolicity, as among other things a socializing force, is something we might rethink. In fact, we might call what is happening at the moment a kind of radical de-symbolization, or even perhaps at a different level, de-erotization, and the social and psychopolitical relation between these two things, symbolization and erotization, is of great interest both in its centripetal and centrifugal arrays. One is tempted to ask whether Arendt thought of philosophy itself at times and under certain conditions as belonging also to the domain of the anti-political, or perhaps rather as oscillating, mediating, and determining what comprises the political and the anti-political. The foundation of much political activity, of course, has been argued many times, is anti-political. One thinks, for instance, of Benjamin's critique of violence. The anti-political, we can say, eventually requires politicization, some kind of re-entry into the social order. Rancière's critique of the unrepresentable is devoted precisely to showing how the unrepresentable resists politicization. Quote, under what conditions might it be said that certain events cannot be represented, he writes in the last chapter of The Future of the Image. Under what conditions can an unrepresentable phenomenon of this kind be given a specific conceptual shape? End quote. Today, one could argue it is not the religious unrepresentable that poses the most significant anti-political threat, but rather biotechnics. It might be useful to bring in here Virilio's distinction between representation and presentation, as well as Beltine on likeness and presence. What needs to be done, among other things, is to determine how these two major forms of fundamentalism or literalism, religious and biotechnic, might be interacting in strange, unexpected ways. So-called religious fundamentalism is an old form of literary literalism, and we can understand religiosity, as Sloterdijk ingeniously suggests, as simply human beings' agreement with their nature as mediums. At any rate, we think we understand the fantasy underlying this form of literalism, and we recognize its ruling images. Religious literalism may seem on the surface to offer itself as an analog of sorts to biotechnic literalism, but in actuality, the two may be far apart. The most significant difference between them is rather simple. In the first, the hidden designer is considered divine and can be said to represent the need for a higher tribunal, to quote Simmel, particularly in intractable political conflicts. In the second, the designers are simply human. Like apocalyptic words and images, the old forms of literalism work to warn, in McLuhan's sense, as well as to subvert. And increasingly today, one could argue also to divert, distract, and paradoxically even comfort us in the face of more wide-reaching, largely invisible developments. As everybody knows, the end of the world, if it happens, is probably not going to take the form of last living man with last living dog, seeking last living female with whom to repopulate the planet, clearly a sexual fantasy. If the problem of literalism is nothing new, what makes its new incarnations of particular interest today is a transformation in the concepts of form and matter. If form is the opposite of matter, then no design exists that could be called material, writes Flusser in The Shape of Things, his little book on design. It is always in forming. And if form is the how of matter and matter the what of form, then design is one of the methods of giving form to matter and making it appear as it does and not like something else. Isn't this the question of the moment? The design or formation of matter, and for what purpose, what meaning? Design, as Flusser predicted, has become a kind of scaffolding or lattice work that is infilled with and informed by matter, in the case of biotechnic art, with living or semi-living matter. A sequencer program is realized in and through this matter, and once actuated, a largely automatic chain of transformations is set in motion, and due precisely to this automatism, the enterprise acquires the affect of destiny, even if this archaic notion is undermined by the sheer velocity of the process. The codified world in which we live no longer signifies processes or becoming, Flusser notes. Does not tell any stories, and living in the world does not mean acting. The fact that it does not mean this any longer is called a crisis of values, for we are still generally programmed by text, and thus for history, for science, for a political program, for art. We read the world, for example, as logical and mathematical, but the new generation, which is programmed by techno-images, does not share our values, and we still do not know for what meaning the techno-images that surround us are being programmed. We can try to think about the question of the program in new ways, that is, in a non-alphabetic fashion, but it is difficult to do so. We are dealing with sequences and their relation to content. Sequences that once put into play are difficult to stop, precisely because they are sequences, not series, and the role played in this process by what Flusser calls techno-images, the major means by which invisible, human-initiated processes are brought into the domain of the political. The old notions of medium, materiality, image, and visuality have clearly all changed. Quote, no more mediations, no more images, notes Baudrillard of cloning in his essay, The Hell of the Same. They can only accumulate, and if that is so, it is precisely because they have not been sexually engendered and are unacquainted with death. We lack adequate terms for the new relation of form and matter, medium, and mediation. It might not be too far off, perhaps, to say that time has replaced the old idea of medium. According to one of its most compelling definitions, time exists so that everything doesn't happen all at once. Time is, of course, said to be the invisible domain par excellence, but its duration is felt as rhythm, which lends it a spatial and indeed body-based pattern. We perceive rhythm, writes Agamben, and the original structure of the work of art as something that escapes the incessant flight of instants and appears almost as the presence of an atemporal dimension of time, something like a more original time. We can replace atemporality with transhistorical and perhaps understand the phenomenon in a slightly different way. Everything seems increasingly a time-based art, for it is primarily time that now separates sequences in their realization, space having been compressed almost to the point of irrelevance. And the relation of temporality to atemporality is of interest. I'm tempted to bring in Boehringer here, who, as we remember, saw the will to abstraction as precisely an expression of the dread of space. Quote, the most strict in its exclusion of life, as he put it, in contrast to what he called the urge to empathy. Quote, a happy pantheistic relationship of confidence between man and the phenomena of the external world. The meaning of this new temporality is almost theological in nature, and one could think of numerous religious, or rather perhaps to follow Agamben, liturgical analogs, the Trinity and transubstantiation immediately come to mind, that prefigured this development in extraordinary ways. It would be interesting to try to understand their emergence in the world as sociological and psychopolitical paradigms for the relation of time, and again what Agamben called a more original time, symbols that manage and regulate sensation, perception, and transformation, perhaps even at the quotidian level, even as they make reference to something that might be called eternity. Last, I want to say a word about the role played by aesthetics and biotechnics, a major means by which matter is made to appear as it does and not like something else. It is the very productions of science, technology, and social relations which will drift towards aesthetic paradigms, notes Guattari in a 1995 essay, Chaosmosis and Ethico-Aesthetic Paradigm. Continuing the quote, today our societies have their backs up against the wall. To survive, they will have to develop research, innovation, and creation still further. The very dimensions which imply an awareness of the strictly aesthetic techniques of rupture and suture. As a sensorial, perceptual, and emotive mode, aesthetics functions increasingly as something like an add-on phenomenon, supplement, lure, or even indeed perhaps distraction, whether as interface, means of advertising, branding, and marketing, or relational aesthetics meant to create participation and community around biotechnic procedures and agendas. It would be difficult to imagine an historical analog to this phenomenon, whether in its earnest or cynical modes, knowing or unknowing modes. Consider, for example, Eduardo Katz's well-known GFP bunny, green fluorescent protein bunny of 2000, which we can take as paradigmatic of the kind of maneuvers artists can do on and with new biotechnologies: aestheticization, pseudo-historicization, cutification, cinemalization, and so forth and so on. The only tactic missing with this project is erotization, which other bio-artists do deploy, as for instance in the work of Kathy High. For this project, as we know, Katz worked with technicians at an institute, a research institute in France, to produce a glow-in-the-dark rabbit, or as he prefers, bunny. The effect was achieved by inserting DNA that had been extracted from a Pacific Northwest jellyfish, as it turns out, the Echoria victoria, into Alba bunny's progenitor. Katz then used Alba in a number of art projects, relational and other, including Alba flags, logoglyphs, the bunny variations, a set of screen prints, Alba sculptures, interventions such as GFP Bunny Paris intervention, which involved posters, lectures, television and radio interviews, and so forth, and seemed to function in a way indistinguishable from advertisement. Many of these projects are featured on Katz's website, as is a brief history of rabbits, with visuals of a Roman coin issued by Hadrian, featuring a rabbit on the reverse side, and representations of rabbits in North American religious art, the general intent of which seems not only the mystification of the bio-creation, but also the inclusion of transgenic art within the lineage of animal husbandry. Transgenic art, of course, is something completely new. It is, as Katz himself tells us, quote, a new art form based on the use of genetic engineering to transfer natural or synthetic genes to an organism to create unique living beings, end of quote. In light of new developments in sequencing, one wonders why we should hang on to the ideology of singularity or uniqueness. And we should question what it could possibly mean to create a transgenic pet and subsequently produce free all the collaterals as if one were not responsible for the existence of said creature. As with this project, many of the technologies currently used in bioart are common technological procedures, and what seems to differentiate biotechnic procedures from bioart is perhaps in the end something like irony. From the standpoint of the biotech industry, the role played by bioart and aesthetics in general should be clear. It is through such measures that the insensation, enculturation, and cultural embedding of practices takes place, practices that otherwise might simply be deemed unpalatable or even completely invisible. In many cases, biotechnical developments would be unnoticeable and invisible without art. Rice infused with human DNA is superficially indistinguishable from rice that has not been genetically modified. In theory, it is interesting to note that at the very point at which veganism has become not just a practice but a movement, we have all de facto and unknowingly become cannibals. It is unclear as to how an art project utilizing this technology would differ significantly from one devoted solely to technological experimentation or commercial venture, and it is difficult to imagine a project that would work to question, interrogate, or subvert the practice of genetic modification and cross-species hybridity, given the greatly reduced role played by intentionality on the part of the artistic creator. Perhaps the supplanting of creator and artist by designer indicates precisely the degree of technological determinism entailed in the new procedures. What would a politico-aesthetic intervention look like in this instance? The current preoccupation with interactivity, immersion, ubiquity, and so forth, terms drawn notably from the world of high tech, suggest a kind of participatory imperative, even as the ideal of hybridity becomes literalized and even as truly unpredictable forms of human-based exchange and interaction become more and more limited in scope and depth. In numerous and ever-widening domains, the user activates sequences, and once activated, the process is thereafter determined. It is a program. In and of themselves, they do not need any input, interactivity, participation, or reciprocity from us. As the possibilities for creative expression become increasingly programmed, and intelligence less and less sense-based, less and less representational, it is interesting to recall Marx's claim in the Economic and Philosophic Manuscripts of 1844. Quote, man is affirmed in the objective world, he writes, not only in the act of thinking, but with all his senses. There is also a, quote, subjective aspect, unquote, to the object. Here's the full quote. Just as music alone awakens in man the sense of music, and just as the most beautiful music has no sense but the unmusical ear, is no object for it, because my object can only be the confirmation of one of my essential powers, and can therefore only be so for me as my essential power is present for itself as a subjective capacity, because the sense of an object for me goes only so far as my senses go, has only sense for a sense corresponding to that object. For this reason, the senses of the social man or other senses than those of the non-social man. The forming of the five senses is a labor of the entire history of the world down to the present. End of quote. Particular senses correspond to particular kinds of objects and vice versa, through a process that Marx does not explain, cannot explain. Perhaps it is close to what Kaiwa called reciprocal topography. Whatever the case, the forming of the five senses, again, is a labor of the entire history of the world down to the present. If artists are to remain social persons, political actors whose talent and sensibility have been formed by and are based precisely on this accomplishment, the accomplishment that is of the senses, a recapitulation of sorts, again, of the entire history of the world down to the present, then they will have to try to understand how to transform the non-sensorial, the non-perceptual, the invisible, and at this point, the indivisible into something sensorial. And indeed, a great deal of contemporary art seems dedicated precisely to such an endeavor. Art being precisely the realm of sensorial experimentation and a prognostic of sorts, perhaps, along the lines of Bergson's characterization of the artist as someone who senses across time. Among those capable of this task, something else is now required in the face of radical undecidability. We can call it discernment or judgment in the most powerful sense of the term. Judgment as to what types of projects, Bio-technic and others, should be visualized, temporalized, sensorialized, and aestheticized, how and to what end, and what types should not. We must act quickly to try to establish the criteria by which such judgment can be accomplished, as well as perhaps the formal principles by which a procedure or an event is aestheticized and thus begins to function in the world in a very different fashion. This judgment is precisely, one could say, the beginning of the political, and the preeminent question for politics is always very simple, and it is this: what are the stakes? Thank you.